Hello and welcome everybody to this online consultation on the converging food and debt crisis. My name is Rosemarie Werner. I'm a United Methodist bishop and I'm working with the World Methodist Council, and I am here to give a brief introduction in what we are doing this afternoon. I welcome you on behalf of all those who are partners in this event. The All African Conference of Churches, the Organization of African Instituted Churches, FIAN International, and the 5 partners working together within the FIA, the World Council of Churches, World Communion of Reformed Churches, Council for World Mission, Lutheran World Federation, and World Methodist Council. We meet at the same time as the IMF, and several of our colleagues are right there in Washington, D.C. to challenge those present to rethink the way to handle and control finances. We meet with the aim to jointly analyze the food and debt crisis, to learn about the responses of churches, and to coordinate our responses as faith-based organizations. Shortly, we will hear more on the current debt and financial crisis and on the food crisis. And we will then, in a second part, after a short break, learn more about responses of faith-based actors and churches and hopefully coordinate our efforts. All of this is, of course, surrendered and grounded in prayers as we meet as people of faith. I ask Reverend Damon Makavira to lead us in an opening prayer. He is working with the Council for World Mission. And afterwards, we will be formally greeted and welcomed by the Director for Public Witness and Diaconia of the World Council of Churches, the Reverend Kenneth Matata. Let us pray.
Of food and debt, we're reminded of your abundant provision and your call to care for those in need. We recognize that hunger and debt are not just justice issues, but spiritual ones as well. The manifestation of the brokenness in the world. We ask for help in addressing the challenges in a way that honors your kingdom values. We acknowledge that we are stewards of the resources you have given us, and we confess that we have not always been faithful in our stewardship. Forgive us for the times we have wasted, neglected to share our resources, or caused harm through financial practices. We pray for those who are burdened by debt, that they may find hope and relief. We pray for those who are hungry, that they may be fed and nourished. We also ask that you guide us in finding solutions that address the root causes of these issues and promote justice and healing. As we engage in this discussion, may our words and actions reflect your love and compassion. May we be inspired by the example of Jesus, who fed the hungry and proclaimed the good news to the poor. And may we be empowered by your Holy Spirit to work towards a world where all fed, debt is abolished, and your kingdom reigns. We pray all these in the name of Jesus Christ, who taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
Before we ask Dr. Kenneth Matata to welcome us on behalf of the World Council of Churches and all the partners, may I quickly tell those who need translation that this is available. Go on the bottom with a little globe and choose the language that you need. And now we are in your hands, Reverend.
I hope you can hear me well. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for participating in this important meeting, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the co-organizers of this consultation that looks at the nexus of food and debt crisis. I thank you for joining this conversation as part of the global community deeply concerned with this complex, worsening, and increasingly damaging situation that the world is facing. We have international experts on food and economics and credible, experienced voices from different world religions leading us in this conversation today. We deeply value your contributions and discussions on this topic. It is only by mobilizing people of goodwill and all people of faith, which are the networks you are all linked to understand and unpack these complexities, that we can respond and effectively find solutions that are sustainable and comprehensive in resolving the crisis before us. Our experts will give a more detailed analysis of our situation, but let me just give an overview of the situation we find ourselves, but also emphasizing why the WCC and all its partners see this as a responsibility to the witness of the church, to the gospel of liberation. The multifaceted and intersection of the crisis between food and debt is something that has been unfolding over a long period of time and can be traced to almost 6 decades. The global public debt has been rising over these last 6 decades and has now reached almost its highest level. Currently, the global debt at around 300 trillion or 350% of global GDP. With this kind of debt, 60% of low-income countries and 30% of middle-income countries are at risk of defaulting on their debt. If we take an example of many African countries, we see that the continent itself has had the percentage of GDP rising rapidly, as the debt as a percentage of GDP has been rising rapidly since 2014 and is currently at 24% of Africa's African continent's GDP. African countries' yearly debt service payments have quadrupled since 2010 and now comprise 10% of their government spending, outstripping annual health expenditure, which is at 6%. Food imports are also being cut down to service these increasing debts, with the rising dollar value and interest rates leading to further price increases. The amounts involved are so massive that it wipes out the possibility of nations serving their people effectively and creating an environment with the options of leading sustainable livelihoods. These numbers are staggering. 69 billion in Africa debt payments are due in 2023, which is more than all aid to Africa in 2021, which was 62.3 billion US dollars. So we live in a world that blindly believes and practices modern monetary theory, which indicates no direct constraints on a monetarily sovereign governments to create money or create debt to fund its spending needs. But this only works when the stimulated consumption is balanced by increased production or investments made to build up and benefit society. We live in a world where economies are linked to the dollar the currency of the currently most dominant economy, but where fluctuations in this currency further destabilize a shaky global economy and unsettle financial markets. That the dollar may be replaced by any other dominant currency in the foreseeable future is something that others are speculating, but this will not change the vulnerability of the poorest of the poor. We live in a world where interest rates are raised to bring down rapidly rising inflation, but which has little effect on lowering food prices. We live in a world that is destroying local, diverse, and traditional food production and systems, and to replace it with industrial agriculture, which depends on external supply of seeds and fertilizers and pesticides to produce crop for cash and also for exports. And this is meant to help service the loans. So you can see that food production is tied up to this complex and paralysis of debt. Food sovereignty is therefore sacrificed to this global system where the scales have been manipulated only to benefit a few. We live in a world where decisions are made in the short term, considering that we are entitled to the world's resources in a very self-centered perspective, endangering the future of humanity and creation. As the Native American wisdom reminds us, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. For this reason, we need to start to be forward-looking. People in most countries must live with the consequences and decisions made by powerful and wealthy people who live far away and who are disconnected from their realities. The question is, how do we start to think locally while being aware of our global connectedness? We need to comprehensively address the root causes and the nexus between food and debt crisis. As faith communities, we have members of all sectors of society. So we bring all of you together so that we can find common ground in these matters. We need to overcome inequity, greed, and self-centered existence in favor of interdependency and mutual accountability, so that we continue to contribute to a sustainable system that promotes justice and access to food, and also preserving the future for the next generations. We are called to action, and the consequences of lack of action can be catastrophic for the world and future generations. We therefore are here not to create another space for conversation and dialogue, but to say from this conversation, how do we build concrete actions that can transform the current economic structures? As we are encouraged by the prophet and challenged by the prophet Amos in chapter 2, verse 6, I will not revoke the punishment because they sell the righteousness for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. The question is, can we respond to this call so that we move beyond commodification of the lives of many and the mortgaging of the present because of greed and using the present resources to steal from future generations? We hope that as we are going to reflect today, we will do so remembering that today there are people who are going to sleep without having any meal. And so when we are talking about these issues, it's not just an interesting conversation, but a matter of life and death for someone. We pray that God may enlighten us in this conversation. So welcome to this conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for these words of introduction, Reverend Matata, and thank you for putting the challenge before us and the call to action. I now hand over to Butch Montes. He will be moderating the next part of the session. Thanks for doing this and blessings for the time together.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the great introduction to the discussion topic that we have today. I will just introduce very quickly the discussion that I will moderate. It's an important discussion on trying to discuss the what and the why of the converging crisis on food and fuel. And we have two distinguished speakers who are presenting actually parts of the two completed studies that they have done. One of them is in the chat box that Nancy has already shared. You know, as Mr. Matata had explained, these are rooted in long historical and institutional realities, but they have immediate implications and immediate policy questions. The first speaker is Dr. Lim Mah Hui. I call him Mah Hui. He's the author of the book COVID-19 and Structural Crisis of Our Time. He has previous experiences in the academia, banking, public service, and civil society engagement, and has a multidisciplinary background in finance, economics, and politics. He chairs the board of the Third World Network. As someone who has worked inside the private sector, you would say the belly of the beast, you can push him very far in our open forum to test your ideas about how to engage and be combative with the private sector. Our second speaker is Sofia Monsalve, Secretary General of FIAN International, a global human rights organization. It advocates, based on a platform of social justice, on questions about the rights to adequate food and nutrition. Since 2021, she has been a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, or IPES. By its consistent and integrated advocacy since 1986 on the right to adequate food and nutrition, FIAN, which she heads, has earned a prominent role among global human rights organizations. In the panel of experts paper she will present, I especially want to highlight footnote 5, which refers to the original World Bank 1981 paper that provided the blueprint for structural adjustment in Africa, which with a very unfavorable impact on African agriculture. So I would like to invite our two speakers, one after the other, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. I will be a timekeeper mainly, and then I will moderate the discussion. So may I please invite Mah Hui Lim to begin his presentation.
Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting me to share some ideas or thoughts on this convergent crisis. We have barely come out. Actually, the world is faced with multiple structural crises of health, of environment, of banking, financial crisis, economic, and also political crisis. So the question is, how did we get to this place? And COVID-19 has basically laid bare the many fractures and flaws in our society, from the health systems to the huge economic disparities, to increasing fragility of the financial systems and political polarization between the have and have-nots. And especially the pandemic has landed on a very wobbly financial stage because this is a result of the global financial crisis of 2008, of which we barely emerged from it and to be plunged into what we call a pandemic of great proportion. And the global financial crisis resulted from 4 decades since 1970s of what we call financialization, where essentially the center of gravity of our economic system have moved from production of real and productive resources to simply circulation and exchange of financial services. And it moves away from creating real value to finance extracting value. And growth in the last 4 or 5 decades has been driven not so much by economic productivity, but by debt, and which is at the center of the problems that we face today. In the sense that because of stagnant growth, the only way for the economic system to propel, particularly in the United States, is to put more debt into the hands of households and corporations. Since, with rising inequality, many of the population does not have enough money to spend because the income is growing much slower than increase in productivity, as most of the productivity has been extracted by the owning class. So for the economic machine to continue to run, you have to put more debt into the hands of the households and corporations. And this actually is at the kernel of the global financial crisis. And that is a result of years of financial liberalization in the economy. And what I will call that the financialization is the second great transformation, where finance, instead of serving the real economy, has come to dominate and to whipsaw the real economy, sending it into one financial crisis after another with almost clockwise regularity every 10 years or so since the late 1970s. You have the US savings and loan crisis of 1980s, Latin American debt crisis of mid-80s, Asian financial crisis of 1990s. Then we had the global financial crisis of 2008. And right now we are heading to another present financial crisis. And the common denominator of all these financial crises is basically cheap money, mountain of debt, and rising interest rates. So we are living in an age where there's just too much money swashing around, too much debt, and where this would lead to bank failures and corporate bankruptcies. And as Dr. Kenneth has stated, to countries, particularly in the third world countries, amassing massive amount of debt, which was unleashed by basically the monetary policies of the Western countries that try to get out of financial crisis. They will lower interest rates and then make money cheaper for corporations, for countries to borrow, right? Central banks, which are supposed to be the guardians of financial stability, actually, unfortunately, plays a very destabilizing role in the financial system. I think most of us are very familiar with the words or the term quantitative easing, right? Which basically means central banks would inject huge amount of liquidity by buying bonds, government bonds, and sometimes even mortgages, and perhaps even long-term corporate bonds, to push down the interest rates. That's basically to try to resuscitate the economy. And banks are flush with all this money that the government, central banks have put into their hands. And instead of lending it to productive resources, to small, medium, enterprises, and to real economy, a lot of the money just basically went into financial speculation rather than productive investments. and then the rich are able to borrow at cheap rates and begin to buy stocks and bonds and property, which will exacerbate, the financial, what do you call, asset inflation, as well as economic inequality. And economic central banks, basically for the last few 20, 30 years, have been lowering interest rate to encourage corporations and governments to borrow. And this happens both in the developed as well as in less developed countries. And this is particularly pernicious for the less developed countries when they borrow in foreign currency loans like US dollar or euro, because when interest rate rise, as we see now, the money will flow out of the less developed countries back to the developed countries, and that would cause the currency depreciation. So many of our developing countries are facing a double whammy: rising interest rates, falling currency value, and inability to service all this debt. And this chart shows the cheap money which has flooded the world since 2001 to 2020, over the last 20 years. Because if you look at the left side of the chart, which is the Fed fund interest rates, which was around 6% in 2000, and then with the dot-com bubble, they lowered interest rate quickly, and then by 2004, the Fed increased interest rates, and that led to the global financial crisis, which is in the middle of the chart. And you can see the interest rates were down almost zero for about over 10 years. And then it went up again. And with the pandemic, it came down to close to zero. And we have never seen such increase and a fast and furious increase in interest rate from close to zero in 2022 to today. Within less than 12 months, the interest rates for the Fed went from close to zero to close to now 5%. And when these things happen, it would have a great implications for the rest of society. And this is just a chart to show the global debt, as Dr. Matata has stated too, which has grown much more since the global financial crisis. So what you have is, the problems has been exacerbated by exogenous shocks of COVID-19 and the Ukraine war. The pandemic shut down most of the world's economy and led to a recession. And in order to get out of it, the government, central banks, as well as the government, had to pump in money through monetary as well as fiscal ways to stimulate. And this was the COVID-19 led to a disruption of the supply chain, which led to increase in the commodity as well as food prices. And of course, it was made worse by the Ukraine war sanctions, which led to more supply shocks. The combination of this demand increase due to the monetary and fiscal policies of the government and the supply shocks of the COVID-19 and Ukraine war sent basically interest rates rising. Inflation rising. And the Federal Reserve now has to reverse the course to raise interest rate to ward off inflation, which has risen close to 10%. And as I said, when you push up the Fed fund rate from 0.25% to 4.75% in a few months, the bond prices collapse. And banks which were holding safe securities, which included US government securities, has suffered huge losses. leading to bank distress, corporate distress, and possibly a lot of sovereign debt defaults. So the moral of the story is that actually central banks, instead of being the guardian of financial stability, they unleash policies to try to find the last financial crisis, and often these policies sow the seeds for the next financial crisis that we are about to experience. That's basically what I would like to share with you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mah Hui. So you have actually explained the importance that everything in the global economy and in the local economy is measured in terms of the financial returns, private financial returns, right? And this will then apply to all of the other important issues that we are very concerned about. So now I would like to call on Sofia Monsalve to please present the study that and whatever else she wants to share with us in her intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and good day to all of you. Thank you to WCC and the other partners for inviting me to present today one of the latest studies that IPES Food has produced on the relationship or the interaction between debt and the food crisis. I think that the key message that we want to come across is that comprehensive action on debt and food systems must go together. And the action required, let me share my presentation first of all with you. Great, good. Yeah, so I was saying that the action required today must come on an unprecedented scale and must address the structural drivers of debt, or what the previous speaker said, the financialization of our economy. I think that this is a very important message. And often overlooked is the critical role of unsustainable, inequitable food systems in driving rising debt and hunger. So in this special report that IPES Food published, the report urges decision makers to act on the debt crisis before it is too late, calling for comprehensive debt cancellation and relief and food systems transformation at the same time. So I will share the main findings of this special report with you. The world is on the brink of a devastating debt crisis. Following a decade of steadily rising debt levels, public finances in low-income countries have been strained by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic disruptions ensuing from the war in Ukraine. Record high sovereign debt loads are driving countries to divert financing away from investing in the Sustainable Development Goals towards servicing external debt. Growing numbers of countries are now facing rising hunger and soaring debt repayments. Food prices are still historically high and global hunger levels are on the rise. Global public debt is at its highest levels in almost 60 years. 60% of low-income countries are now considered at high risk of or already in debt distress. 21 countries are nearing catastrophic levels of both debt distress and food insecurity. 16 are least developed countries. These high levels of debt are crowding out critical investments in meeting SDGs. Among LDCs, debt service exceeds core social spending on education, health, and social protection by 125%. So the next slide shows you, this graph shows the percentage of low-income countries in or near debt distress. Since 2013, the number of countries in or near debt distress has nearly tripled. In this map, it shows the countries most severely impacted. We marked all of the developing countries near to or in debt distress in crosshatch, and the World Food Programme and FAO designated hunger spots in red. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most affected region in the world. Least developed countries also stand out on this map. 2 LDCs have recently defaulted, Somalia and Zambia. 6 LDCs are in debt distress, Malawi, Mozambique, the Republic of Congo, São Tomé and Príncipe, Sudan, and Zambia. 16 LDCs are nearing catastrophic levels of both debt distress and food insecurity. Afghanistan, Burundi, Central African Republic, Chad, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Malawi, Mauritania, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Zambia. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic disruptions ensuing from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including high import costs for food, fertilizer, and energy, and now rapidly rising interest rates and depreciation currencies are hitting the most vulnerable countries the hardest and risk plunging millions into hunger and poverty. The US Federal Reserve rates have risen from 0.08%, as the previous speaker also mentioned, to almost 5% in a year. Over a third of developing countries have seen their currencies depreciated by more than 10% against the dollar. The world's poorest countries saw the cost of servicing their debt increase by 35% in 2022. Creditors have changed considerably over the past 2 decades. In 2022, poorer countries paid 47% of external debt payments to private lenders, 12% to China, 14% to other governments, and the remaining 27% to multilateral institutions like the IMF. Private creditors tend to charge higher interest rates. Further, domestic debt has risen sharply, and because of its higher interest rates, domestic service is higher than external debt service in 90% of LDCs. Interest rates and debt servicing costs are projected to rise further this year and next. So, debt relief is urgently needed, but it is not enough. Often overlooked, it's the critical role of unsustainable, inequitable food systems in driving rising debt and hunger. In this special report of IPES Food, it identifies 4 ways in which food systems are deepening today's debt crisis. So the first, in this chart you see how we think these 2 are interconnected. Breaking the cycle of unsustainable food systems, hunger and debt is vital to comprehensively address this crisis. Import dependencies, extractive financial flows, boom-bust commodity cycles, and climate-vulnerable food systems are combining to destabilize the finances of the world's poorest countries. So the first factor, import dependencies and boom-bust commodity cycles. Today's food import dependencies are a legacy of increasingly specialized, concentrated industrial commodity chains and the flawed agri-development pathways prescribed for low-income countries over recent decades. I think, Manuel, you referred to the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and IMF, and I think it is very important to recall that they are the main responsible for dismantling national capacities to produce food. So we are referring here to the capacity of governments to ensure, for instance, rural extension services, public rural extension services, to ensure food reserves, the capacity to build, and distribute food reserves, and so on and so forth. All this is gone. It was privatized. That's why we see today the grain trading corporations as the main, as those holding actually reserves. We don't even know how much reserves they have because these markets are extremely opaque and there is no transparency about how many reserves are there because we don't have these public systems. So I think this is very important to say that the privatization and financialization of food systems is actually one of the main responsibles for the hunger crisis that we are seeing today. So this is why 77 developing countries are now net food importers, and Africa's food import dependency has tripled in recent decades. This leaves countries exposed to food price spikes like in 2022, and requires them to earn dollars via export crops to keep importing staple foods and other essentials. As prices spiked in 2022, countries in sub-Saharan Africa spent an additional $4 billion on food imports while receiving less food overall. Extractive financial flows is the other factor. Over decades, governments have cut social spending and outsourced food system investment to corporate actors and creditors, resulting in uneven development, persistent hunger, and the depletion of state capacity, and ultimately funneling resources out of the global south. And the last factor is the climate breakdown. Is fast becoming the biggest threat of economic collapse and debt distress in the global south, decimating harvests and destroying livelihoods in countries least responsible for this crisis. With climate finance failing to materialize, it is becoming harder for low-income countries to repay debts and invest in climate-resilient food systems. And the scale of the challenge only increases. For example, African countries are expected to need to spend $1 trillion just to adapt to climate change. Record high debt burdens are preventing urgently needed investment in sustainable climate resilient food production and food security, creating a vicious cycle. This time around, debt relief must go hand in hand with transforming food systems and building resilience to climate change and other shocks. The transition to agroecological food systems provides a long-term answer to reducing food and fertilizer import dependency, hunger, climate vulnerability, and to getting off the debt treadmill. So my last slide is on recommendations. The failure to break this vicious cycle of unsustainable debt and unsustainable food systems will mean abject failure to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Urgent action is required to provide debt cancellation and relief and development finance on a scale sufficient to meet the needs of COVID-19 recovery, climate resilient food systems, and the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a need for a wide-ranging debt cancellation of payments, at least for a couple of years, and debt relief, and massive injections of new climate and development finance, ideally in the form of grants to avoid further debt buildup. Mechanisms to suspend the debt obligations in the face of shocks are also required and should be urgently explored, and rethink the parameters and formal definitions of sustainable debt in line with the vulnerability so many countries are facing. In particular, we think that the funding to public policies necessary for agroecology must be scaled up. For countries in the global south, agroecological food systems transformation is critical to escape from cycles of debt and hunger and could potentially unleash huge benefits. By shifting from input-intensive, export-oriented industrial agriculture to diversified agroecological food systems, low-income countries can cut crippling food, fertilizer, and energy dependencies. The ability of agroecology to deliver a pathway towards food security, sustainability, and resilience has become increasingly clear in the face of COVID-19 and climate shocks. Furthermore, emerging examples from around the world suggest that major food system shifts are possible without compromising food security and with major socioeconomic benefits. The second recommendation is about repairing historical injustices that have left countries funneling wealth to the global north through windfall taxes on food profiteers, steps to achieve tax justice, and reparations for ecological and historical debts. And the last recommendation is to democratize financial and food systems governance, reform decision-making over food systems, and in the World Bank and IMF to put the interests of the world's poorest countries and marginalized population first. And here, establishing an independent sovereign debt authority to provide critically needed democratic oversight and coordination functions is one of the key recommendations. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the further exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofia. We have had two very interesting presentations that have actually wrestled with the problems that we are facing right now, right? I don't want to speak too much, but let me just try to fix some pictures in your mind, and then to make the argument about, I'd like to run a 30-minute discussion and ask questions and have people ask questions and share their own experiences to connect with the presentations. But first, let me present two pictures that come to me with respect to these discussions. First, with respect to the African discussion on public sector with respect to food systems and debt, right? A late friend of mine, Andika Makandawiri, used to tell me stories about how Africa got into structural adjustment programs. He said that for a long time, the African governments had what they called marketing boards, which would buy the food from the local areas and provide credit and financing. But with the structural adjustment programs, the IMF and the World Bank, with their view of how economies work, convinced the countries in Africa to close down these marketing boards, right? And some of these marketing boards were actually inherited from the colonial period, because these marketing boards were used also by the colonial powers to extract values from their colonies, right? But now it was under the control of the democracies, the local populations, and because they have been dismantled. And this is the 1981 paper in footnote 5 of the IPES paper. They have been dismantled as a result of that. We lost the presence of the national government, the national state, in the remote areas. And often that was the only presence of the national state in the remote areas with respect to growing of food and food security in many of these countries. The second picture that I'd like to fix for you, and I don't want to speak too long, is during World War II, about 60 to 80% of Britain's food is actually imported, right? They import from Europe, etc. During World War II, they were under a German blockade, and this study that actually Amartya Sen, economist, always brings up. And during the World War II, the government was forced to institute a rationing system on food, right? Because then the food that they were getting that was available for all the society was actually much less than they were used to, because they were importing a lot of the food. It turns out during that period, malnutrition in Britain declined greatest over the long history of Great Britain, right? Because what they had to do was a government officials, right? Government officials had to figure out how to ration, how to allocate butter and calories and cereal, and in a certain sense, it overcame the domestic income distribution problems with respect to access to food, right? So this is for me, this is a case study of how it's not a question of more food and more production. And that was one of the things that the World Bank, IMF program, structural adjustment tried to fix before, because they thought that the African countries should begin to export, right? And they didn't need to worry about producing their own food, because they can always trade. They can always export more. When you export more, then you can use the foreign exchange to buy food from abroad, right? And then we also know that food is heavily subsidized in the rich countries, right? So this is a thing about the capability of the state to intervene. So let me now give final comments. What I would like to urge you to in your thinking and in your sharing is to think about it as a systemic issues, which both of us, both of the presentations have discussed about. It is about an economic framework. It is about a system of beliefs, a system of ethics, a system of how we undertake our mutual responsibility to each other. So I would like now to open the floor to discussions, and you can also put your questions in the chat. I don't know whether it can be done by just unmute yourself and then you can ask the question. There is one question in the chat box now from Masiwa Bunda. What can churches and other people of goodwill do to counter the debilitating reality of big corporations' monopoly in the seed production industry? 4 companies control 50% of the seed in the world, and the seeds are produced to appear to be impossible to replant from harvest, meaning small-scale farmers are spending a lot of money buying seeds and chemicals, thereby keeping them in a cycle of food and poverty. I have another story about this with respect to but I won't do it. Let's get Maui and Sofia to please answer the question. Let me just tell you what the thing in my head is about. It was the first decree of the Provisional Coalition Authority in Iraq, and among the decree, which closed down they required farmers to surrender all of their seeds at the end of every harvest. Right? This is an example of how we protect the monopoly of seeds globally, right? There are many decrees there. They closed down the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, etc., right? But one of the things that farmers have to surrender all of their seeds at the end of the harvest. And we know that the biggest technological contributors to agricultural productivity are the farmers, because they know which part of the field actually have seeds that are more productive than others. But because of this kind of monopoly that is imposed on this, they have to surrender all the seeds, right? Because they cannot mix the seeds with all the seeds that they get from the private company. So Maui, can you may I please ask you to respond, and then I will also ask Sofia to respond.
Yeah, the question, I guess, it came up is, what can the churches do, right, to counter this massive powers of cooperation? I mean, it is basically a political action that we have to take. We have to educate our member churches and members of our churches about how the economic system works, and essentially then we have to organize our nationally our governments can take policy measures to try to develop, as Sofia and Montes say, alternative ways of basically producing food, of distribution. So those are, I think, are ways that we should work towards. And in terms of big corporations, of course, marginally, we can try to intervene in terms of lobbying the governments as well as the corporations. And I know that churches and all that, some of them have stock ownership in some of these corporations. They can take more active steps in making the government, so the companies take more, what do you call, socially responsible policies. So, as I said, these are basically political issues that, organizing that the churches have to get in with civil societies and all that to push back the power of corporations.
Sofia, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I want to make one precision, which may sound pedantic, but I don't think it is. Well, according to some of the statistic, it's not even 50%, but it is 3/4 of the commercial seeds market. And I think this is it's a crucial distinction. The commercial seeds market is like the formal market on seeds, but we don't have statistics about how much of the actual really use of seeds is non-commercial, meaning peasants, indigenous seeds. This is like invisible because it's not counted, it's not recognized, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think it is a crucial distinction, because particularly in Africa, we know for sure that the share of commercial seeds is I don't know, some people say around 20–30% of the really actual use. So this means that the peasant seed systems, the small farmer seed system, is much larger than the commercial one. So therefore, I think that what the churches can do is simply support traditional customary uses of seeds, because actually the main problem, the way we approach this problem is that we have an extremely unfair, discriminatory legal field, because whereas commercial seeds are protected by international laws, trade agreements, the UPOV protection, the intellectual property rights protection schemes, peasant seeds are not even recognized. And we are saying this is a human rights violation, because the right to seeds is a human right. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants has recognized seeds as a human right. And therefore, governments must enact laws to protect peasants' rights to seeds, which are basically customary. This is customary law. And I think in continents like Africa and Asia, where you have very vibrant customary law systems to govern land, for instance, this is also extremely important to govern seeds, because communities do have their norms. You know how to exchange, how to save, and so on and so forth. So this is what we are encouraging. I think in West Africa, we see progress. Governments have started recognizing the customary peasant seed systems and protecting them, because this is the problem, that the commercial seeds want to encroach, want to grab these genetic materials in order to put patents on that, and of course to monopolize afterwards access to that. But I think in a continent like Africa, this this struggle, this fight is far from being lost for peasants, and therefore we have to put all our efforts, also for the other continents. I'm Latin American, I'm Colombian. We are not in such a lucky situation, but still we have to strengthen us. And I think it would be the role of churches, to support seed banks, community seed banks, and all these different forms that are out there to deal with diverse ecological systems are very important.
Thank you. There are two questions. Well, just one quick comment, right? It's a matter of, Sofia said, it's a matter of law, right? A lot of these laws have to be changed. So part of and laws are based on ethics, right? And part of the role of church, as far as I can see, is to highlight the ethics behind these laws, right? And so let me ask Nancy, she has a question, to ask her question. No? Okay, then there's a question from Edward Domen. I hope I got the name right.
That's right.
Okay, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I wanted to do it orally. It is
Yes.
that as Christian organizations, and we really need to remember the Jubilee. And Jubilee is based on a very modern theory. The founding of UNCTAD is based on it. The dynamic that the rich get richer at the expense of the poor who are impoverished. And this leads to mounting debt and all sorts of other things, as the Jubilee describes. And the Jubilee in the Bible simply says every 50 years you should write every debt off. And we are Christian organizations. I don't see why we're beating around the bush, looking at details when there is a very simple solution. Of course, it's not a permanent solution, because the day after you've done that, the process gets going again. And so 50 years later or whatever, you have to do it again. But debt default is a long and traditional activity of governments, the United States first among them. The conquest of the West was funded by defaulted debt. So feel free. And I think as Christian organizations, we're not being radical enough in this discussion.
Thank you. Maui, would you like to react?
Yes, I do agree that a lot of this debt, particularly that has been foisted onto the countries, are not only unsustainable, but they have been unproductive, and they are basically to help, the private creditors and all that to amass wealth, and hence we should push for debt relief. But having said that, I think we have to move to try to figure out how we don't get into that system again, because as Edward said, you want to do it every 50 years, but I think we really have to figure out among the developing countries how to have alternative systems. And I think we are at the crux of a very important point in our history, where the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon financial system, underpinned by US dollar, has been basically a cause of the major problems in the whole world economy. Because as I think Nixon or somebody stated, the dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. And we have seen more recently the weaponization of financial system, where trade, credit, and all that, and even your national bank reserves are being frozen by the superpowers of the world. And fortunately, I think that the Ukraine conflict and the seizing of all the Russian assets, but of course they have seized the Venezuelan assets before, Iranian assets, But this one, is of course the biggest crisis that we face. That all other countries in the world are getting together to trade bilaterally using their own local currencies and to find alternative payment systems. I think those are very important steps we take, on top of what our friend Edward was talking about in terms of debt cancellation and restructuring of debt.
Sofia, would you like to react to the question about we are not radical enough in this discussion?
Yes, probably we have to become much bolder, and I think there are very good reasons for debt cancellation. Not only economic ones, but also issues of the ecological debt, for instance, is I think one big issue, is also an important demand of the climate justice movement. And there are other historical grievances. I think slavery, it is a historical grievance, right? I think there are many groups also demanding that indigenous peoples and African population being enslaved and so on and so on. So there are also very good reasons, and I think which are also for Christian churches extremely important reasons, the creation, reparation. And eventually they will have to lead also with good example, because it's not that Christian churches were not involved in the expansion of capitalism in the world. So I suppose that we have to be bold, and this means also uncomfortable issues for ourselves, in order to really be very, very faithful to our beliefs. And I think I definitely agree with that.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Larry Perkins. What are the best levers within the United Nations to which NGOs can appeal to address the food crisis and the debt disparity? Maui, would you like to take that first?
I think, Manuel, you have worked in the UN system. You probably know better than me on, I don't think I have enough of knowledge of the UN system to tell which are the best levers. Perhaps.
Sofia, do you have any comments on this about NGOs operating in the internet? So let me answer after Sofia does, right?
Good, Manuel. I think it's a difficult question, I have to say, because we are seeing our trust in the UN being severely undermined. It's not that the UN has been perfect, a perfect democratic body. It has not. I think we are still living under the power arrangements coming out of the Second World War. So we have a Security Council with 5 powers, and that's it. We cannot do anything about that. And I don't think that this is democratic, right? So we have really big tasks to do in order to democratize the UN. But in this aside, we are seeing the trend of what we call the corporate capture of the UN, which is basically corporations taking over, sitting, at the table in order to decide rules and policies, meaning to prevent governments to take actions to, for instance, roll back corporate power. And I think the financialization, what Marc presented, how this has happened, it has been possible because governments decided to more or less give up on their regulatory powers, right? So that is why we see the regulation, privatization all over. So it is really a severe problem in the food. I think you invited me also last year to talk about, remember when the UN Food System Summit was organized, why large parts of civil society actually decided to stay out of a UN summit. It was because of that, because we are seeing the UN Secretary General's office really aligning with corporations. And now all this agenda about the Summit of the Future is for us quite actually very problematic, because in our view, this is the scaling up what happened in the Food System Summit. And this means the multi-stakeholderization of the UN, getting rid of clear rules and norms, governmental decisions, intergovernmental negotiations. And we are now opening up a huge bazaar or forum where everything is possible and the powerful are taking decisions and no one realizes how exactly. So we're very concerned about that. Despite this, I think we have to create a new agenda for reclaiming the UN, if you want, reclaiming intergovernmental decision-making spaces, because I mean the United Nations Charter talks about we the peoples. I think we have to follow that agenda of really deepening and democratizing this space, and we have today new challenges. I think that is very important. This is a task ahead of us. We need to come together and, you know, get a sort of, at least as civil society organizations, a new agreement. How do we want to see these United Nations of the future? Now, I think there are also hopeful spaces, but Manuel, probably you will be in a better position than me to talk about what's happening in the UN around the UN Tax Convention that the United Nations finally decided to start negotiations around that. I think this is probably the best news of last year for all of us. And I think what groups like the Finances for Development mechanism is doing is really very encouraging. And because we are facing a system crisis, I think this is, it seems to me, a very important message to rally behind all the work that the groups on Finances for Development is doing, and tax justice is one of these key areas, but also debt. So I will stop here because Manuel, probably you are much better placed to speak about that.
Well, I don't want to. I think you covered the problem very well. Let me just say that when we think of the UN, well, first of all, let us think of ourselves as the churches, right? The people of faith, right? When we think of the UN, there are 3 UNs. One UN is the UN of the diplomats, our governments, which we are not completely part of, to which we actually also advocate against, we combat against, we also fight against. There is the UN of the Secretariat, or as part of the Secretariat, right, which are where all the corruption happens, right? But there are also a lot of research and a lot of new thinking happens, which we can try to influence. And then the UN of us, right? The peoples that Sofia talked about. We are in the people's group of the UN, right? And we have to bring the UN accountable to us because it was built like this. And Sofia actually talked about the problems with the UN with respect to the private sector trying to count themselves as NGOs, right? And distorting the discussion space. I need to stop now because we've had we've run out of time for this part of the program. And I'd like to say, I think the plan is to have a 10-minute break. And then we will come back to hear voices from the different regions. So what I'd like to do is thank everybody for this discussion. And I'd like to then transfer the microphone to either Rosemary or Manoj, right? So thank you very much for the 2 presentations and for such a rich discussion. Thank you. So Manoj,
yes. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you so much for moderating this session. Friends, we will take a short break, but don't disconnect because we will take a break for 10 minutes. So it's in exactly 10 minutes, we start the second session. This is very important because we will be hearing voices from the different regions. And we would like you to come for that part as well, because and then we will have another round of discussion. And we will try to conclude after that. So please remain, and those who can come back, or please try to come back because this is very important. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions or clarifications? feel free to unmute and speak. Okay,
It's also there's a discussion going on in the chat that people might like to look at, right?
yes. I mean, we have been very, very much guided by the very important discussions we heard from the leading experts, and they are bringing the voices of a whole panel of groups of people, from the NIFIA panel, from the IPES group. So these are quite important voices, and they speak for a whole community. So we are deeply, grateful for that. But now we will be hearing about, voices from the regions, from the real life situations. Thank you for all those who have stayed on. It's a very important section that we are going into now. Let me introduce myself. I'm stepping in for Nikta Lubale. I'm Manoj Kurian, the coordinator of the WCC Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance, and we have the Food for Life campaign, and really glad to work with our economic and ecological justice the department and the NIFIA panel so that we can look at this very critical issue. Now we go into this very important session where we are asking our colleagues from the ground, from the different contexts, to give what are the churches, how are they responding, and so let's see the voices from the ground. So the first, Mervyn Abrahams works with the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Mervyn, welcome, and he runs a very important organization which actually charts the costs of food in South Africa, and he uses a wide network of people, and his organization's charting and monitoring helps the government policies, and is a very important watchdog function they carry. Please come in. I hand over to you, Mervyn.
Thanks, Reverend Manoj, and thank you to everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Even though Sylvia's map did not include South Africa in the sense of being distressed, the reality is that food prices, a basket of 44 very basic foods in South Africa, has increased over the last year by something like 11.6%, and now costs more than your average wage income for an average worker in South Africa, or at least for about 50% of wage earners in South Africa. So with this increase in food prices, we have also seen, of course, a corresponding heightening of household level food insecurity, as well as, of course, increase in hunger, as well as child stunting, which presents major human rights, but also economic issues for the future of South Africa. And as we've seen, and I find this nexus quite interesting, in the sense, as we have seen food inflation increase, we have, of course, as globally, we in South Africa have also seen a corresponding increase in interest rates from the central bank. Now, it's quite interesting that in our case, we are more and more beginning to see the connections that, in fact, increasing interest rates has contributed to this increase in food prices, because with farmers carrying massive debt and corporates carrying some form of debt within the food value system, and all of that, of course, being offloaded onto the consumer at the retail end of the food value chain, that has, in a sense, contributed. And it raises a very interesting and an unjust question, because for those who are wealthy, food constitutes something in the region of 10 to 15% of their expenditure. And so food price inflation does not impact them as much as it impacts those who are poorer. And so we have seen large scale inflation. And we have to actually ask the question, whether it is inflation or greedflation. Greedflation, why? Because we have seen that banks are huge increases in terms of the profits that the banks have been making. We have also seen in the South African context, with a very high monopolization of our food system, we have seen that food producing companies have also posted massive profits, all at the expense of ordinary South African families. And so the question then arises as to what can the church and what should the church be doing? And it seems to us that the church could be involved in about 4 various areas. The first is that people are in dire straits and people are needing food today. And so the task of relief, the task of the ministry of distributing food, actually during the season of Easter, is an important aspect for the church. The second area would be for the church to become more involved in utilizing its access to land and its access to resources to encourage more church members to grow their own food closer to the table where it is consumed, and of course in a more agroecological manner. So those are 2 immediate things that churches can become involved in. The third area is more in terms of advocacy. Churches also are shareholders in many banks and in many corporates. And so the whole question of shareholder activism needs to be revitalized within the churches. We have seen that very effectively about 10, 15 years ago. And it seems that that is again an area where churches need to become much more involved in terms of forcing the food retail sector and the food manufacturing sector to become more aware of the question around profits versus hunger. And actually at the retail level, because most of the food system's power resides at that level, retailers can become important actors for change in the food system. And so with churches being shareholders, can utilize its power in terms of shareholder activism. And the final area is what I would like to suggest is what has already been mentioned in this discussion, and that is the whole area around declaring and raising the question of the Jubilee. We have seen the debt Jubilee 2000 really bring to the fore a global awareness and consciousness of debt and historical debt, and the need to free countries and peoples from the debt they are aligned in. And we believe that the time for such a campaign is necessary right now. And so with that few words, to sketch what for us in South Africa is important. And of course, Africa is very different, and South Africa's economy and food systems are very different from, say, Zambia or Sudan or other parts of Africa. And yet in South Africa, we are seeing an increase in hunger and an increase in household food insecurity. And that, of course, as I've said, is also coupled to the question of household debt and the increase in interest rates on some of those debt. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mervyn. And Mervyn pointed to the lot of work. We are not highlighting, and we should recognize the tremendous amount of ongoing work that the churches are doing of sharing of food. We are not discrediting, and we need to acknowledge that, especially during the Lenten season. there's a lot of good work that is going on, but we are looking to further expand it. Now I invite Dr. Mrs. Mercy Ajini from the All Africa Conference of Churches to step in now to give her input.
Once again, good afternoon, good day, everyone. I am highly delighted to be here as part of the discussants for this meeting. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. My network here is quite unstable, but God helping me, I know I will land safely. Thank you. I am here to discuss specifically on food security. According to the 2022 Global Report on Food Crisis, shortage of food across Africa is a bone of contention, where people can no longer have access to food due to change in climate, increase in conflicts, and unproductive farming have compounded the food crisis problem in Africa. And the international community of the Red Cross has called for immediate and long-term intervention. Dominic Steelhart, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross Global Operation, says millions of families are going hungry and children are dying because of malnutrition. He says they are scaling up their operations in countries like Somalia, Kenya, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and many others to try and help as many as possible. But the number of people going without food and water is staggering, limited across to vulnerable populations due to insecurity. Insecurity has become the order of the day, and the fighting in Russia and Ukraine made the production of wheat and grains to be drastically reduced. The food, we need more people on board to tackle this crisis. The bulk of the ICRS work is helping people stay alive, but it is not nearly enough. Crisis of this scale needs to be concerted effort from governments, humanitarian partners, and donors to focus on mid and long-term support to help those affected to get out back on their feet. This needs to be really prioritized, says Steelhart. Let me speak from my country, Nigeria, where I represent. In Abuja, January 16, 2023, according to a report that was given by Conrad Hamosi, says nearly 25 million Nigerians are at risk of facing hunger between June and August 2023. If urgent action is not taken, it will lead to a lot of crisis and a lot of problems will emanate from that, from the report given. This is a projected increase from the estimated 17 million people currently at risk of food insecurity. Continued conflict is another challenge that is affecting the food security. Climate change, inflation, and rising food prices are key drivers to this alarming trend. Food access has been affected by persistent violence in the Northeast in particular. I am privileged to reside in the Northeast of Nigeria, the northern region. Currently, Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe are armed banditry and kidnapping in states. The state is not secure. A lot of insurgencies, a lot of insecurity, people do not have access to their crops, to their food. They cannot harvest what they have planted because of insecurity. We have cases of banditry, kidnappings, and armed robberies. If no drastic measure being taken, would give high increase of insufficiency of food. According to the National Emergency Management Agency, widespread flooding in 2022 rainy season. The last year rainy season has seriously affected a lot of farmlands. It was reported that more than 76,000 hectares of farmlands were damaged. Harvest and increase the risk of food insecurity for the families across the country. The flooding is one of the effects of climate change and variability impacting in Nigeria. All of you agree with me that last year rainy season was a serious menace to Nigeria. It affected a lot of lands, farmlands, and even the crops. And that brings increase in food security. Of the 70 million people who are currently food insecure, 3 million are in the Northeast. The states I mentioned earlier, talk about Borno State, Adamawa State, Yobe State. Without immediate action, this figure is expected to increase to 4.4 million in the land season. This includes highly vulnerable displaced populations and returns who are already struggling to survive a large-scale humanitarian crisis in which 8.3 million people need assistance. The food security and nutrition situation across Nigeria is deeply concerning, said Mr. Martins Kilmer, the resident and humanitarian coordinator for Nigeria. I have visited, he says, he has visited Nutrition Stabilization Center filled with children who are fighting to stay alive. We must act now, the time is now, to ensure that we get out and have support to be able to bring out this menace. Children are the most vulnerable of food insecurity. It is approximated that 6 of the 70 million food insecure Nigerians today are children under the age of 5, living in the states I have mentioned before, the 3 major states, Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe. And then Zamfara, Katsina, as the case may be, due to banditries and kidnapping cases. This is a serious risk of mortality among children attributed to acute malnutrition. When we talk about food security, we're not talking about the availability of food alone. We're talking about the quality of the food. We're talking about the quantity of the food and the access to the food. It is very necessary. It is very important that we bring this to table, and as we are discussing it, that we take up actions that could be able to address this situation. Now, looking at the question before us, we said, how do we churches respond? How do we churches respond to this situation? One, we need to create an interface with the government, engaging on issues that have to do with food security. I know that this interface is in place, but we need to improve more on this. We need to act more on this. We need to make sure that it is workable. We need to meet with the government, the church leaders, create an interface where you meet with them. Dialogue, bring on the table the necessary actions that need to be tackled to address this situation. As church leaders, again, we need to join the debate on good governance and interact and prescribe the possible way out on how to get out the situation of this food security or insecurity. As church leaders, we need to encourage the congregation on farming, especially local farming, like vegetables. We need to encourage the members of our churches to try and produce, to plant what they eat. They shouldn't depend on exported food, no. Go back to your backyard, check within your environment, create a garden where you can plant some necessary things. Give it a trial and work on it, and it is workable. It's not everything we need to go to the market to get. There are some things we can actually plant it and make use of it. as a matter of urgency. We need to actually work on that. And then we need, as church leaders, to invite professionals to train the members of the church on how to use farm tools or equipment. We need to train the farmers, especially the women. Let me come from the women aspect of it. It will interest you to know that women are in the front line of food production, right from the production process to the consumption. We really have an idea of how women are at the front line, but these women are not educated. They don't know much about the farm tools. They don't know much about how to use it and how to cultivate it. They need to be trained. They need to be financially buoyant. They need a farmland. Some of this farmland that the women farm on are the properties of their husband. And sometimes when the husband died, what they need to do is that the family of the men retrieve back the land. So women need to be encouraged. And as church leaders, I want to drop this last point, that we need to advocate for stronger programs where churches should be encouraged to have agricultural department in the church, just as we have evangelism and mission department and every other sector in the church. And if this is done, it will help greatly in minimizing the issue of food security. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mercy. You have highlighted such very, very important points. And, the issue of conflict, which is, of course, linked with the climate emergency. You've raised the issue of women really empowering and also, really recognizing the role of women in the role of agriculture and economy, which it is terribly underutilized and under-recognized. In fact, they're doing a lot of the work. But the conflict, and these are big challenges. But thank you for giving your input. And now we'll invite Dr. Tinashe Gumbo. He is responsible for the economic and ecological justice work of the All Africa Conference of Churches. Dr. Tinashe.
Okay, thank you so much. So I will not take much of your time because my colleague has actually elaborated a lot of what the church can do from the African perspective. So what I will do is just to share with you the overview of how we understand and how we see the problem in general terms from the African perspective. So as the churches in Africa, we have actually appreciated that the issues that have been shared, the issue of food insecurity, debt crisis, are actually moral issues, they are ethical issues, in as much as they are also technical issues. And we are very happy that we have continued to work with our technical experts who have managed to explain some of these things in our own language in such a way that we are able to reflect on the matters from the pulpit itself, and we will continue to do so. And it is actually one major tool that we need to continue using as the churches. So as indicated from the previous presentations, Africa is actually burning in terms of the two issues that have been raised. I will zero much on the data aspect because Mercy has touched on the food security aspect. So in our interaction with our members, we have confirmed that indeed debt has remained a major issue. At some point, we thought debt was no longer a major concern for the churches, but come the COVID era, towards 2023, we actually see this as a new emerging challenge for the churches. And indeed, this is not detached from other challenge that we continue to face as a continent, issues of corruption, issues of illicit financial flows, how we continue to lose a lot of our resources, mineral resources, finances that are supposed to be used to address the food security issues. I think you have been following the latest news from Zimbabwe, the issue of the gold mafia, where a lot of resources have been lost and not serving the majority, but only a few of the people. So you will see that it's all about morality issues, ethical issues, injustices that are surrounding this discussion. So whatever we do, our intervention should actually be addressed from an economic justice perspective. So as Mercy has indicated, the issue of debt is not also detached from climate change. So as AACC, we try to be holistic in our approach. As we address the issue of debt, we also try to address issues of climate justice. As a result, we have adopted a model that we are using where we have established two critical institutions or two critical networks that are addressing these issues on behalf of the church at very, very local level, because we believe that everything happens at local level. We cannot generalize the crisis. So we came up with a network which we call the Africa Faith Actors Network for Climate Justice. This is a network which is made up of not only Christians, but also Muslims and other people from other faiths, which means our approach is interfaith when it comes to issues of climate change, as it is related to issues of food security. So this is an approach that we think is actually working for our towards our goals, because it addresses issues of adaptation. It also engages at very, very local level. It also raises awareness around these issues. But at the global level, this network also assists us in engaging at the COP processes. So this is one approach that we are using, but we have also came up with another network which we call the ecumenical economic justice network, where MES actually belongs. This particular one is also focusing on these issues of debt, these issues of corruption, issues of financial illicit financial flows, so that they are able to engage at their own level. So I think these are the approaches that we think can also be replicated in other regions. But in summary, I can say that our approach is comprehensive because it tries to link issues of debt, issues of climate change, issues of corruption, issues of tax justice, issues of food security together, so that they can actually be addressed from the same pot. And I'm happy that the report that was presented also took that particular approach. But we are also respecting the issue of inclusivity, and you have seen that our networks also work or tolerant to other faith, people of other faith, the Muslims and other players, the civil society. So issues of inclusivity is also another issue. And then lastly, the issue of evidence-based approach, where we work with our experts to profile the crisis. We cannot just generalize it, but we need to understand, to have an appreciation of the unique situations. So we do researches that then assist us as we engage at various levels. So this is what I can say. This is what the church can do, and this is what the church is already doing in Africa through these networks, also through these comprehensive approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tinashe. This is very, very enlightening, and to show how you are mobilizing our churches in a very self-reflective manner, because we are also, you're looking at accountability. You're looking at while, getting things together and addressing issues in a comprehensive manner. Thank you so much for this. We will come to the discussions towards the end, so we need to quickly move on to the Latin American input. Is from Reverend Dora Valenta, who represents the Protestant churches in Latin America. I welcome Reverend Dora. She will be speaking in Spanish. Reverend Dora? Sorry, I think she has an issue with she was online. It must have dropped off. Well, okay, while we wait for the Latin American input, we will go into the Asia Pacific input. There are two representatives, two ordained ministers, Reverend Jenny Peter from the Protestant Church of Molucca. She's also a member of the Central Committee of the WCC. Please come in. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Manoj. Hello, everyone. Greetings from everyone. Nice to meet you all through this meeting. I'm Reverend Jana Peter. I'm from the Protestant Church in the Maluku, the church in the Eastern Indonesia with 765 local congregation among 2 provinces in Eastern Indonesia. And I speak from my context in Eastern Indonesia, since Indonesia is very diverse, and I speak from indigenous life experience. First, I would like to give some information that the culture in Eastern Indonesia is different from Western Indonesia in terms of food. In Eastern Indonesia, we have a main food, namely sagu, or sagu in our language, a food that we process from the stem of the sagu tree. A plant with the Latin name is Metroxylon sagu, maybe include in the palm tree family, or if I'm not mistaken. Since 1973, the government of Indonesia has carried out a kind of cultural division in which all area must be planted with rice or paddy field to strengthen the economy. It may also related to the demand of IMF fund provider. Maybe Ms. Sofia Monsalve can explain it moreover. Since then, almost all of the sagu forest has been replaced with rice field, and even now it is still happening. Because of this, it is difficult of many indigenous people in Maluku to have access to food to their forests. Sagu forests connected to the center of their life are replaced with the rice field to grow rice. In fact, sagu forest not only matters of access to the traditional economy of indigenous people, but it's also central of life for indigenous people. It's also have relation with their religiosity, living structure, and natural balance, which are directly related to the totality of their life and automatically related to their identity. Some times ago, discrimination grew and illustrated that people who eat sagu are poor people, because sagu processing is always connected with indigenous people who are still trying very hard to maintain their life system, even though sometimes they have to struggle to gain access to sagu forest, because big change that's still happening today to open up a rice field. Until COVID-19 occurred in 2020. Access to food was difficult for several areas in the context of Eastern Indonesia, especially in Maluku and North Maluku, where we consist of small islands that support one another. But because there are travel restrictions, it's making difficult for the community to access their food sources, because many ports are closed. But through research conducted by the church, it turned out that we find there are several people on the island who are not affected by this policy because they maintain an economic system that help one another, among others. The name system is Ma'ano and Babalu, the process to exchanging food through war agreement and collective harvest, so that people can access their food source, especially for the sagu tree forest. For the additional information, because customer system is still strong, each land and forest in the island belongs to the certain family, and everything is related to the customary system and structure. And the most interesting thing is that all these practices are carried out by women as the main actors. For those who have heard about the conflict, social conflict that occurred in Maluku, in Eastern Indonesia in 1999 until 2017, women were the main actors who started the reconciliation process. Because of that, the Protestant Church in the Maluku as a church focuses on strengthening these women groups and tries to implement in other women groups in other local congregation. And this is what church can do. Since talking about food, we are actually talking about women, because in the form of indigenous people in Maluku, women, we always related to a food provider and processor, because we don't have a form of division like society in general, that food provider are only a man and women are a processor, and make it as a women is a second class in the society. And hopefully by the strengthening this group, it will help people in getting access to food, but also restore their habit, their traditional system, and their identity, which has been changed only by the aim of strengthening the country economy or Indonesian economy. This is just an example that I can give from my context, from my church context, and how we start to responsible about food security, and actually it is can maintain from our indigenous system. Thank you, Manoj.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And here we have, examples of clear alternate strategies, some things which are very much outside the economic system, but also of collective action. Thank you so much for your experience. Now we will hear Reverend Romila Robinson. She's an ordained minister from the Presbyterian Church of Pakistan and a member of the Central Committee of the WCC. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Manoj, for giving me this opportunity to be here today and meeting all these wonderful people. It was definitely a wonderful experience for me to learn more about the food security and debt crisis, the economic condition of the countries around the world. And it's my privilege to speak about my country, Pakistan, what is the current condition of the economy of Pakistan at this time. I would start up with its basic contribution. The agriculture is the fundamental part of Pakistan's economy. And Pakistan's agriculture contribution is about 21% with an annual growth of 2.7% to the economy. Agriculture provides employment about 44% to the labor force and around 62% to the rural population, depending on their sector for their livelihood. And if we expect the total amount that goes up to $29,854 by the end of the 2023. The main crops in Pakistan are rice, wheat, sugarcane, corn, mustard, and some of the other garden crops like onions, potatoes, etc. And these are used as a source for the export for the Pakistan. There are other number of problems and challenges at this time that Pakistan is facing with respect to the food and agriculture sector. That is the limited cultivated areas, poor financial status of farmer, the lack of access to advanced agriculture technologies, insufficient infrastructure, old methods of agricultural production, low per hectare yield, and salinity and water. As the country still reels from the devastating floods that hits last time, which government officials estimate that it has damaged around 80% of the country's crops. And it has covered around the 2/3 of the land of Pakistan underwater, along with the economic uncertainty. As many as 828 million people are at this time are unsure about their next meal will come from. Other than that, there are other factors, there are other reasons that are affecting the food security that comes as the high inflation, a widening trade deficit, and a shortage of foreign currency reserves. One of the main causes of this crisis is the country's chronic energy shortage, which are causing widespread disruption to the industry and the commerce. Along with it, the high food prices, lack of rainfalls, droughts, and livestock diseases, all that has added up into the food insecurity in Pakistan. The food inflation rose from 8.3% in October 2021, and then it has rose to the 15.3% in March 2022. And now it is up to 31.7% by now. By the end of the 2022, and by now it is 35% of the rises in the prices of the food. So undoubtedly, other than the high prices of the food, the climate is also one of the factors that is affecting the cropping timely. If we go up to the facts and figures of Pakistan, Pakistan is the 5th largest country with respect to the population in the world. The total population of Pakistan is around 238.1 million, according to the estimation of 2023 data record. And it is increasing almost up to 2%, which is around 4.6 million every year. And it is the 7th largest army in the world, 6th largest nuclear pileup in the world. But still, Pakistan is unable to make its claim to be assured that it's not easy to make a default, because the facts and figures are completely opposite of what the government of Pakistan claims to be. Pakistani government is currently around under debt of $7 billion to pay around till June of this year. As the rate of the dollar has been increased, the value of the Pakistani currency has decreased a lot, which was 150 rupees last year, but it is now up to 290 rupees, equivalent to $1. So if we go to the fiscal policy, it shows that per person debt under increased from 179,000 according to the data collected in June 2021, and it has increased up to 216,708 by the June of 2022. This poor governance and low productivity per capita in comparison have contributed to the balance of payment crisis, which the country is unable to earn enough foreign exchange to fund the imports that is consumes. At this time, Pakistan is relying on their imports, but unfortunately, they are unable to stabilize it. As well, due to the bad strategies they are applying to increase the value of the economy in Pakistan, and that is increasing the rate of the interest over the purchase and sale of the products. And they are destroying the imports badly, because the more interest they apply, the more are the chances that the people are unable to buy the things or the products, and they are not able to utilize it. And when they are not buying it, ultimately that is affecting the economy of Pakistan and also the food insecurities within Pakistan. According to the estimation, the exports at this time are rising around 2.7%, and imports have cut down up to 18% per month. So according to the Modi, it has been estimated that Pakistan has become one level down from CAA1 to CAA3, which is a very high credit rate scale. And it means that this CAA3 means that it is going below the average of the investment rate. And it is one level away from the default level. And if we go According to the IMF, it also says that because they have some of their other demands of the defense projects, they are very sensitive issues dealing with the Pakistan. Unfortunately, Pakistan is not working on these sensitive issues of food storage and the food crisis, and they are focusing on the other things like the Kashmir issues and their relationship with India and other things. And Pakistan is getting into a severe condition where people are not able to know how they can survive within this very tight routine, and where they have no security of food, where they have no security of their livelihood, and where they are not sure where the government is going. So as far as the church is being concerned, how they can play their role in preventing all these issues, I believe that there are some of the things that they can work together with the government or with other organizations, that to raise funds, humanitarian efforts to prevent famine in the country. It could be the investment in the smallholder farmers, sporting farmers, where they serve to with the provision of what is needed to crop whatever they are cropping in their areas. Investment in climate smart agriculture and climate sustainability programs, promoting planetary health diet programs, eliminating food waste and developing food banks, ensuring everyone can afford nutritious diets, and self-support towards sustainability towards pastors and the victims of the people who are facing this food insecurity and food crisis. So I will conclude by saying that Pakistani government is not inclined towards what they are supposed to be at this time, to looking at what the condition of economic condition of Pakistan is at this time. Rather, they are very non-serious about the current situation, and they are developing such strategies and plans which are not very helpful for gaining the strength or to rise up its value, economic value or the rate, rather than it's taking it down and destroying the economy and the sustainability of the country. And it's also becoming a cause of less productive on their agriculture, which is the main source of their sustainability in Pakistan. So such inflation and downfall is creating an unsafe place to live and hard to believe what is the future of our generations. It arises a question, what we as a people of God and organizations take part to minimize the efforts or effects of the food convergence and debt crisis. I would like to share one link of the YouTube in the chat box. For your information, if you will go through with that link, you will have a lot of information that what the Pakistani economic situation is at this time, and how it is difficult for it to maintain its political sustainability, its economical sustainability, and also the livelihood of the people with respect to the food and security. So I hope that will be one of the informative site for you to listen to it. And thank you so much, Manoj, and every one of us for listening and
Thank you.
saying that how the Pakistan is going through it.
Thank you, Reverend Romila, because you have highlighted some of the geopolitical situation is actually contributing also as a huge distraction for governments and from actually addressing the deep problems of society. Dora could not actually join, but we have her input on in writing. Walter, can we just put it up, and then maybe I can request the interpreters to interpret what she has shared. So you'll have to go into the interpretation and click to English because you have to go into the go to the interpretation box in the bottom and click English. Yes, please. So you can listen to the translations.
In the page of the Committee for the Abolition of illegitimate debts called The Business of Hunger in Latin America. It presents the inflation post-COVID and its relation with the excessive growth in the price of food. It and the war, and because of the blockages of gas and oil and fertilizers supply, and also of basic products such as wheat, maize, sunflower, and also because of climatic phenomena that has been extreme and that has committed the production of food all over the world. However, even though the production and the reserves of foods would be in the right levels to satisfy the world demand, with the fall of the prices of gas and oil between 2020 and 2023, the general index of prices of the food is continuing to be 14% higher than in 2021. And the main economies in Latin America, the inflation that we have in food closed at 2022 above the double of the price of other prices of consumption. The growth of the index of prices in food in general in the region during the last 12 months reached almost 12% in September in 2022, comparing with the 7% of the general inflation. Latin America is the main exporting region of food products all over the world, but 4 of every 10 people suffer of food insecurity, whether it be very serious or moderate food insecurity. And this is compared to 1 out of 10 at the global level. The 8% of all the people that have are suffering hunger in the planet live in our region. 56 of the 768 million people, according to FAO in 2022. Brazil, the greatest world exporter of soy, maize, also of meat, and meat from both chicken and all the meats, were having in 2022 more of half of its population living in some degree of food insecurity, 58.7%, and 33 million people were in state of hunger. Extreme poverty affects almost 82 million people, and 1 out of 5 people cannot allow a healthy diet. This makes us the region where it's more expensive to eat healthy all over the world. And this has been aggravated by other inequalities that we have at the social level between the North and the South in each country. In the little time I have, it is impossible to develop all the implications that this has for the region, as mentioned in the article named before. But we can say that the crisis, the food price crisis, is not a food crisis. It is a structural crisis of the system, of the agro food system and the industrial system that has been financialized and ultra-specialized. In this scenario that is so complex and also so marked by the inequalities and inequities, it is important to try to find answers from the faith perspective that can mobilize our communities in the articulation of political strategies and also educational strategies that not only expose this reality, but also can empower, especially those people living in the rural areas. And can you scroll down, please, a little bit? And also I wanted to mention some ideas for reflection. One of them from Mexican theologian Eliseo Perez Alvarez. In an article he mentioned in his book Ser y Comer, an article that says, who does people say that I am? We are not people if we don't eat. Commenting on the Gospel of Lucas, related the food in the 15,000, counting women and children, with the question of the identity of Jesus. In the multiple interpretation and explanations of this text, Perez Alvarez says that we need to go back to the spirit of Plato, who said that spiritual food satiates more because it has more being. However, he also continues saying that this hermeneutical aspect from the hunger that a belly feels can bring other results. It emphasizes that it doesn't involve multiplying, but to divide food. Jesus is enabling its people to be to have solidarity for each other. The language of Jesus is not that of the capitalism, but of hospitality. And he is refusing the primacy of money above food and bread. And he says that the bread and the fishes are to be shared to be able to satiate hunger. Sorry. So buying and selling has a sense from solidarity perspective. We need to sell what we have and give it to the poor. And then you can come and follow me. Lucas 18:22. End.
Thank you very much for this interpretation, and Dora for the message. Thank you very much. Adriano, you have something to say? Sorry, you have been spotlighted, or you have been okay. So
I couldn't hear the speech in Spanish.
Okay.
Pressing all the buttons,
Yes,
and
sorry,
accidentally my voice came out.
Yeah. No problem. Sorry, we will send you the text and then we'll put all the presentations and make it available for all. I beg your indulgence to extend it, to stay on for another 10 minutes because we have run out of time and we have to cut short, of course, the discussion. It is so important to hear the regional voices. It's important that we listen to them directly. So with your permission, I ask for us to just extend for 10 minutes. And we have two brief interventions from North America and Europe. Brief interventions. Reverend Larry Pickens, Reverend Dr. Larry Pickens is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, but he was actually heading up the work of the United Methodist Church, their work in the United States on the General Commission on Christian Unity and Interreligious Concerns. I invite Reverend Dr. Larry Pickens.
Thank you, Manoj, and I will be brief. It's difficult to speak for an entire continent, but I'm, of course, coming from the United States and particularly from Pennsylvania. I liked what Taneshi described as linkages, because I think that speaks to the reality of food insecurity and the debt crisis that we experience in the United States. The COVID-19 crisis created for us, I think, a stress test as we came to understand the true impact that the reality of poverty has upon particularly communities of color in the United States. It exposed much of the food insecurity that we have within this country, and the reality of food deserts, where it's very difficult for communities to even acquire fresh foods, vegetables and fruits, meats that will sustain their bodies. The economic disparities were surfaced. Many of us were already aware of those disparities, but I think a light was shined upon these realities. So we had this dynamic taking place, and now we have in our country the inflation rates increasing, and bank bailouts have been taking place, and all of these dynamics, I think, have an impact upon our communities. So when I think about the role of the churches and what we've been doing, we've been trying to mobilize with congregations, with judicatories in our area, to talk about ways that we can address issues that impact these issues around food insecurity and the debt, but do it in a way that helps us understand that they don't stand alone. You know, we live in a country where there are 400 million firearms, and all you have to do is look at the news to learn about the experience that we're having with gun violence in this country. Gun violence has a definite impact on economies, and particularly in urban centers with people of color who are impacted in negative ways when it comes to how communities seek to sustain themselves. So these issues are part of the conversation that we're engaged in as it relates to the dynamic of food insecurity and debt relief. What we've been doing most recently is addressing some of the questions about issues around policing, community policing, and the impact that it has upon communities of color. Also issues around reparations. We've been engaged with congregations in our area that have worked to bring about justice in communities, particularly working with a congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had its land taken in the 1950s by eminent domain, because in those days, it was common practice that in some communities that were Black and brown, their properties were taken by eminent domain and then developed. So we're about to enter into a historic agreement with the Bethel Church and with the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team, which has land rights in the area where the church was located, for development to take place that will bring about economic growth for communities of color in that area. So that's one of those opportunities that we've seen happen with churches and church leaders actively engaged in addressing these issues around how we develop economies for people who have oftentimes been displaced, and how we began addressing issues of hunger in those communities as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We at the Pennsylvania Council of Churches are also committed to bridging the gap between the urban and rural sectors. We do a lot of work with farmers in the agricultural sector. And we think that there's an opportunity for us to build alliances between the agricultural sector and people in communities that are living in food deserts, to bring those two communities together. And this is the kind of role that we think that we can play. I saw someone describe this as an entrepreneurial way that the church can relate to communities. And I think that that's the strategy that we're trying to promote in what we're doing here in Pennsylvania. I think that will suffice for what I'd like to share, Manoj, and I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue and look forward to hearing from others as they share their experiences.
Thank you so much, Larry, for raising up some of these critical issues and practically telling how the churches are dealing with this. As a last input, we could not get a more authoritative voice. Edward Domen, who is not only a theologian but an eminent economist, who has been one of the pioneers of this intersection of economics and faith in the ecumenical world. I invite Edward to share a few words from the European perspective.
Thank you very much. We in Europe are among the haves. There's this saying in the Bible. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. There's a saying comes up again and again in the Bible that to those who have will be given, and they'll have so much they won't know what to do with it. And from those who have not will be taken even that which they have. Well, we're the haves in Europe, and so we're on the winning side. So what do we do about it? There are two complementary policies that one can think of. One of them was very nicely stated by Ambrose, one of the fathers of the early church, who said, if you have two pairs of sandals and your neighbor is barefoot, you don't give him one, you return his pair to him. And the second one is much more topical. Very recently, the British government got a 600-page report from Professor Dasgupta in Cambridge on sustainable development policy for Britain, 600 pages. But when he was challenged to give a summary, Dasgupta said the other day, pay for what you use. And basically, if we are rich and getting richer and the others are getting poorer, it's because we're ripping them off. So paying for what you use is a very good start. And the seventh commandment, if you count in the Protestant manner, which is don't steal, is translated in the French ecumenical translation of the Bible much more convincingly, do nothing which will hinder your neighbor's capacity to meet their own needs. And we are therefore called to respond to the needs of the deprived. And Calvin, the reformer, actually put, not in his comment on the commandment don't steal, but in the commandment don't kill, much more radically, that we must do everything in our power to preserve the life and well-being of our neighbor, firstly by providing them with what they need, and secondly by stopping taking away from them what they need. So I'm trying to be extremely brief. I'm a Quaker, and we Quakers have a slogan which is speak truth to power. And I'm delighted that several times in this discussion, the question of shareholder activism has come up because with basically a number of Protestant theologians and activists in Switzerland, we founded an activist shareholder movement which enters into dialogue with companies in which they own shares. And I'm particularly involved in the part of this movement which is dealing with Nestle. And we have an ongoing conversation because, as I said earlier, these problems are never solved forever. You've got to keep working on them. But we've had an ongoing conversation with Nestle, in particular, on what it's doing about paying a fair price for coffee and cocoa. And the discussions are very interesting, and it is worth entering into discussion rather than simply lambasting them for not paying enough, which they're not, of course. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join you.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you so much for really giving a clear example of what you're doing and still as churches in Europe. I would now, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have time for discussion, but I will hand over for wrapping up and concluding words to Reverend Dr. Philip Vinod Peacock, who is the executive for Justice and Witness in the World, the WCRC, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and he is one among the 4 staff members of the Collegial General Secretariat sharing the leadership of the organization. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manoj. And friends, I think we have had quite the feast here while discussing questions of food security, food sovereignty, and debt. I would like to begin actually by reading a poem. And this poem says, every noon at 12, in the blazing heat, God comes to me in the form of 200 grams of gruel. I know him in every grain. I taste him in every lick. I commune with him as I gulp, for he keeps me alive with 200 grams of gruel. I wait until next noon. I now know he'd come. I can hope to live one day more, for you made God come to me as 200 grams of gruel. I now know that God loves me, not until you made it possible. Now I know what you're speaking about, for God so loves this world that he gives his beloved son every noon through you. And this is a poem that was written in a food for work camp in Bangladesh. The question we've had before us today, at least speaking from the perspective of churches, is what, or is there even a theology of food? Right through the Hebrew Bible, for example, we see that God is always providing water and food, whether it is to Hagar in the desert or an Elijah who is running away. And in the New Testament, we find that Jesus is always eating, sometimes breaking laws to do so, and preparing food for others. What we do know from our own contexts and situations is that food is not just about providing nourishment to our bodies so that we can sustain ourselves for another day, but it is also how our societies themselves are organized. For us as Christians, food has a very deep theological meaning. After all, we remember our God through the eating of food. It is interesting then that the Lord's Supper in the earliest Christian writings is not linked to the Passover meal. However, this is a deliberate act by the gospel writers because they want to place the Lord's Supper in the context of liberation, connecting it to the forgiveness of sins. In this unique way, we find that the food crisis and the debt crisis are integrally linked in the Lord's Supper. The forgiveness of sins, as mentioned so many times in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, which speaks about the Passover, is not about the working out of our personal salvation, but is instead seeking debt cancellation, seeking reparations, is seeking towards working towards a just and inclusive community. The Passover, therefore, is about liberation. It is about reparation. The communion that we share is about sharing the gifts of God and the work of human labor. We read about the feeding of the 5,000, a story that symbolizes to us the Lord's Supper. And it is a story that on one hand speaks about the inability of the market system to provide for food. The disciples claim they do not have enough money to feed so many people. And in each one of the Gospels, this is a story that comes after the story of the beheading of Herod. Herod's beheading of John the Baptist, The story of the beheading of John the Baptist takes place in a party that Herod organizes for his birthday. An exclusive party that ends in violence and is contrasted with the party that Jesus offers on the meadow, to which everyone is invited and everyone has enough. It is a story in which food emerges from the community and everybody has a share in it, removing food sovereignty outside of the monarchy of unjust taxation, outside violence, and locating it in communities who are able to open up and share once more with each other. It is restoring food sovereignty to the community. Very interestingly, and I will close with this, Martin Luther, when he was writing many years ago, wrote about the land going fallow because of debt. He recognized that there was an integral link between debt and the food crisis. And today, once more, we are called to recognize this question and look at it through a theological lens. And so I close once more with a poem, which is also perhaps a prayer. Heaven is rice. As we cannot go to heaven alone, we should share rice with one another. As we all share the light of this heaven's stars, we should share and eat rice together. Heaven is rice. When we eat and swallow rice, heaven dwells in our body. Thank you very much to each one of you for being present here today. And I hand over the session once more to Manoj. We hope to take this forward in regional online meetings where we can have deeper discussions over this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Philip, for this very powerful. And I would hand over for a closing prayer. From Lusungu, yes, from Lusungu, from the Lutheran World Federation.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the beautiful time that we had together, reflecting about debt and food crisis. We thank you for the luxury that we have, that we can sit here with our stomach full, thinking about these issues. But while we think about these issues, we bring before you the many people who cannot sit and think because they are hungry. We bring before you the many people who have to do even degrading jobs just to put food on their table. We bring the thousands of people who have food but do not know what they will eat tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We bring before you the decision makers that make decisions that brings others into debt while enriching others and giving them surplus that they will never use. We bring before you pastors and preachers and religious leaders and help them make sure that
They preach a gospel, they preach a message that will convict people to share and not protect greed. We bring before you each and every one of us, like as an agent of sharing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend Lusungu. Lusungu represents the Lutheran World Federation, which is part of the NEFIA panel of organizations and one of the organizations co-organizing this. What we can, as we say, and deeply grateful to the interpreters for staying on for extra time. Thank you, all of you, for staying on for the full conversation. We really, really value your participation. We have your contact emails. We will collect all these resources and send to you. And we look forward to your response. We want your input and your thoughts, what we can do as follow-up, because this is a conversation bringing together a very important topic that is very important for the future of this world and our communities. We look forward to your inputs. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the resource persons who participated, and thank you all participants. Thank you for your patience and staying for time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.